Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the CBIT COVID-19 research that we're going to present back to you today. It's a pleasure to be here and to be presenting to you in a webinar format, the first time for us in this sort of format. Hopefully everything will go smoothly and hopefully you'll be able to feel like you're in the flesh present at a presentation and that you don't lose any of that interactivity in today's presentation. So wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. We held it at this time because we wanted to make it available to our New Zealand friends where it's somewhat later in the day. So thank you for joining us at 7 p.m. Also for our Perth friends and Singaporean friends are 3 hours behind, as well as all those people waking up in the UK. So thank you for joining us. And for the next hour or so, I'm going to take you through the two different reports, the CBIT report, the retail one firstly, and then the office report. So obviously the last, I suppose it's now 2 months, 2.5 months, has been a fairly unusual time for all of us. I don't think any of us expected that 2020 would pan out the way that it has. It's a fundamental shift on a number of levels in terms of how we work, and in particular for the property industry and the real estate industry in terms of how we try and attract people to come and visit our places, particularly at this point in time as we're leading into a recovery. So understanding how people might reconnect with physical environments, feel safe in the process, and remind themselves of what's so engaging and attractive about experiences within the built environment. So we wanted to do research that was not only at the good end of the spectrum in terms of the recovery, but also it started in April, this research, talking about the baseline from which we were building. So this is actually going to be the second piece of research that we've done into the impact of COVID-19 within the office as well as retail sectors. So you'll see that in today's presentations, we'll be able to track a bit of a progression, and we're hoping that in the coming months, we'll be able to see even more of a progression towards that recovery, which is so critical for all of us and for the industry in which we work in. The format is basically the retail presentation first. For those of you who are interested in the office presentation, it will come up second. I'd encourage you to still stay on the line. There's many things that are applicable across both presentations, the retail as well as the office presentation. All of us work from workplaces, whether it's working from home and being flexible in how we work. All of us shop in retail environments, so there'll be things that you can relate to with both presentations. So I'd encourage you to stay on the line for the full hour. So I'll talk to the retail presentation for about 20 minutes or so, then we'll have a Q&A section, and then I'll present the office presentation, and again we'll have a Q&A at the end. So you'll notice that down the bottom of your screen there should be a Q&A button, and if there's any questions as we go through, feel free to use that. And then we're going to answer the top 3 questions. We probably can't afford time to answer all of them, but the top 3 questions for both retail and office, obviously time dependent. So feel free to log your questions as we go. They'll be collated here in the background by Stephanie, and then when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll try and answer those questions as best I can. At this point in time, I wanted to especially make note of Skyfi's contribution to the research. So Skyfi and Brickfields have been partners for a while. We've worked together, known of each other professionally for a very long time, and it's a pleasure to be able to partner with them on this research. So they are in on the phone call here, and certainly you'll understand that a lot of what they have to offer integrates quite closely in with market research and market perception. So they're in on the phone call here, and we look forward to having conversations with you going further forward in the future. In terms of the research methodology, so it's probably worth touching on some of this before we get into the detail of the data. So the research methodology for retail is slightly different from that of office. With retail, we've had the pleasure of being able to ask the same set of people the same questions 2 months in a row, which provides us with a really powerful opportunity to compare not only just one set of respondents with another set of different respondents, but the same set of respondents over time. So it's about as accurate as you're going to get in terms of mapping and tracking perceptions and behaviours over time. So we've actually been able to align the responses of those participants in April with the same responses in May. So it's quite accurate in terms of how that's played out. So there were about 800 responses in April's set, and then there's about 450 or so of those 800 responded again for May. It was done through an online panel. It was a survey that was run online from the end of April, the last week of April, into the 1st of May. So we published it and called it the May results. For all intents and purposes, it's almost May. It's certainly May by the time we published it and analysed it. And the same thing applies for the office research, which I can introduce when we get to that point in time. With office, it's a specific target of professionals that work within office towers and office buildings across Australia. It's fair to say as well, for those people that are dialing in from overseas, that a lot of what you'll see in this presentation is applicable across a global setting. So it's not just going to be the Australian market that we're talking about today, even though obviously that's the context in which we're researching. Many of the things that you would see here are going to be behaviours, perceptions and practices that would apply across much of the Western world and many developed economies. So I'd encourage you to not just view this as being localised research within Australia. I would imagine that for many of the countries that are fast moving countries coming out of COVID-19, they would be facing the similar opportunities within retail as well as workplace settings. Obviously, for those of you who work in the property industry, this is a generic benchmark. So what I'm going to present to you today is not going to be anywhere near as specific as it would be if you were running it with your own customers. And we are running this research with specific customers and within their portfolio of assets. And I can reassure you it's far more insightful when it's talking about actual customers of yours as opposed to just the generic benchmark. So that's worth flagging at this point in time. The way that it's structured is a top 5 to make it really easy and digestible for you. We've reformatted the report and we're only going to talk to the top 5 today. So the top 5 themes in retail, starting off with this idea of gradual recovery. So the outlook is definitely looking more positive, particularly in countries like Australia and New Zealand. Not so much in the UK and the US as yet, but certainly in the Australian and the New Zealand market, possibly in the South Korean market and the Singaporean market, we're starting to see gradual green shoots of confidence that's taking place. One of the things I wanted to share with you is a confidence metric that we've set up that was comparing April with May, and we'll also track this into the future. So in April, we used 3 different questions, the responses to 3 different questions to come up with an overall confidence metric. So those metrics that we were looking at to represent confidence were customer satisfaction, reduction in COVID-19 behaviours overall, and there were a number of those, which I'll talk about a bit later, and the propensity to revisit the shopping centre sooner. So those 3 things have made up, those 3 measures have made up what we call a confidence index, and it's out of 100. So it's a percentage. And you'll see in April that measured 53.6% of a total score of 100. And in May, that's gone up by almost 5%. So we're seeing a noticeable improvement in terms of how customers are engaging with retail centres and building their confidence coming out of the worst of COVID-19. So it'll be really interesting to see how that might improve in June, July, and so on. But certainly a 5% increase is a solid start overall. And we wanted to introduce that as the number 1 point because it's probably the best summation of the results, that there's gradual and noticeable improvements across the board on a number of different measures. That probably isn't significant, but it's certainly noticeable and noteworthy. The second point is really around this idea of perceived risk that's changing. So as time passes by, COVID-19 fluctuates in terms of its impact and the perception within the countries that it's in. Australia, as I mentioned, similar to New Zealand and other countries that are probably those fast-moving countries that have done quite well at containing COVID-19, they're in the situation of being able to, the luxurious situation of being able to open up more of their public spaces sooner. We're noticing that there's 4 different metrics that we're asking people around COVID-19 and what they perceive to be the biggest attraction as to why they would use a shopping centre. And whilst the idea of contracting COVID-19 is still the number 1 dominant factor, and it's actually gone up slightly in comparison with those other 3 factors, you can see from this graph here that there's also a diminishment in terms of the idea of unknowingly passing COVID-19 on to others. So as people have realized that it's not as widespread as they might have originally confronted, they've realized that the risk of passing it on is less, the risk of contracting it slightly more, but noticeably the main jump of the 4 factors that we were measuring between April and May was the idea of being exposed to unfavorable shopping behaviors. So that sort of panic buying increased by 5% between April and May. And so that's not kind of, read into it in terms of a weighting between the 4 factors. And it's just basically saying that it's becoming something that's more of a detraction relative to other detracting factors. But it's probably fair to say that overall, there's less detraction in terms of reason to not visit shopping centres in May than there may have been in April. So it's just something to watch in terms of whether that becomes a trend in the future and whether that idea of passing it on diminishes even further. The worry about unknowingly passing it on to others diminishes further in June and July. The third point in terms of something of interest that's come out of the retail research that we're seeing a trend towards is this idea of new modes of shopping. And this is probably the most interesting point. The first 2 are sort of points that you acknowledge and you sort of move on and start to look towards the future. There's sort of present markers or signposts of where you're at this point in time. The third point has the potential to influence future behaviours. So we've all been forced to do things in a way that we've never had to before around how we shop, precautions that we've taken, limiting our exposure to other people, buying more online, not getting access to in-store experiences. And it's interesting to see how that's going to affect people's impressions in the future and change their ongoing behaviours in the future. So one of the things that's quite interesting, and this is part of our COVID-19 kind of measures, that's part of that confidence index that we talked about at the beginning. One of the things that we measure is that idea of online. Are you buying more online? And that's the thing that's jumped most significantly between April and May. And so that's something to probably watch. And it's certainly a bit of a red flag for physical retail to understand whether that's going to have long-term implications for physical retailers. Are those sorts of online behaviors, particularly with audiences that would actually kind of almost prefer to have a physical experience, is that going to stand the test of time? Are they going to continue to purchase products through online providers well into the recovery? So that's something to watch. It jumped by 10% between those 2 months of April and May, and it may well jump again within June. You can see that the only factor that's gone down in terms of a sort of a COVID-19 behaviour is that idea of buying certain products, more of certain products. So for example, toilet paper. So that panic buying is diminished, which is good to see. And certainly that allows retailers to be a bit more predictable in how they stock their stores and the supply chains associated with that. But all the other measures have either stayed the same or increased slightly or fairly significantly in the online retail space. So more takeaway food, more from local retailers, and less in-store purchases going on. So it'll be interesting to see how these measures play out over time, because this is probably the least positive set of data within the retail report for physical retailers, and probably the one that poses the most complex challenges for the future. In terms of new modes of shopping, there's also this idea of whether people are going to change their behaviours around contactless shopping. Are they still going to use those sorts of services post the peak of COVID-19 and well into the recovery? You can see here in terms of the options that were presented to shoppers between April and May, there were 5 different options around how customers plan to interact with their shopping centre of choice in the near future, all the way from visiting all physical retailers, regardless of the situation, through to only visiting for contactless click and collect, through to selectively visiting the retailers that you need to. And it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of people have decided that how they plan on shopping in the future is only visiting for contacted click and collect. Now, this doesn't actually represent what people are actually doing. This represents, I guess, their ideal of what they would want. And I suppose after 2 months of data, it's starting to show that this is not just a fad, it's not going away. Even at the peak of COVID-19, it was strong. It's strong, just as strong, if not marginally stronger now within the May survey. So that would be the preference for people. As to whether they actually shop that way is a different story. So again, this is something complicated that we'll just have to wait and see whether it pans out and whether that desire for contactless continues beyond the peak of COVID-19. If we offer it to people, will they use it? Will they use it well into the future when the risk is diminished, is the real question. And then finally, we've got this graph in particular that talks about changes in COVID-relating shopping behaviours between April and May. And the one thing I wanted to talk about, which is probably something that shopping centre owners and operators have been grappling with for quite a while, is how they create a more distinctive shopping experience. And you're seeing there that there's a slight rise between April and May towards those people that are buying from more local retailers that probably are closer to home, probably more likely to be one-off retailers, probably more likely to be owner-operated. So if that trend continues, then it might have implications around retail mix within shopping centres and the expectation that there'll be a lower proportion of national chains versus a higher proportion of one-off retailers. So that's something to certainly consider and worth watching over the coming months, because if that's something that they've gotten a flavour for through COVID-19 and they want more of it, then chances are it will flow on to leasing strategies within larger retail centres. Number 4 is this idea of a sense of safety builds intention to return to normal. So obviously we've looked at those COVID measures sort of coming down, the risk about passing it on to others has diminished, and those other factors associated with COVID-19 are also lower than what they would have been in April in the May survey. So I guess what we're seeing from that is that there's a higher likelihood today that people are thinking that they're going to return to a shopping centre in the near future, and they're feeling a bit more loyal about their relationship with shopping centres. They don't feel like it's quite as serious as it possibly has been in the past in terms of changing the fundamental behaviours. So on this next graph, you can see here, firstly, do you feel personally vulnerable or exposed at higher risk? And you can see the numbers of people that answered no between April and May jumped slightly by about 7%. There's a second question which we haven't displayed here, which is talking about the idea of, do you know someone within your family? And again, that sort of jumped by 8% in terms of a no answer that might have been exposed to COVID-19. So we're seeing that there's a marked reduction in those people that feel threatened or vulnerable in relation to COVID-19. And obviously that's giving people confidence to then go out to shop. And we saw signs of that in Australia, at least, in particular with the shopping centres and the reopening of department stores over the weekend that we've just had. Certainly a high degree of confidence, no worries about social distancing like there might have been in the month or so previously. On this next slide, we're seeing how that might flow on in terms of changing people's perceptions around whether they're more satisfied, more likely to return to visit, more likely to spend more, whether their shopping centre is meeting their expectations or exceeding their expectations. And you can see from these 5 different measures of that sort of satisfaction metric with shopping centres that we've got marginally more representation on the right-hand side of the graph versus the left-hand side. So the middle section is no change at all. And so that's obviously well supported. And when we mean no change, there was a scale of 1 to 10. And because we could match up individual respondents, we could see whether there was even a single point change in their answering of that question between April and May. And so a surprising 42% of people did not change their point scale score. So if they gave it a 7 out of 10, they gave it a 7 out of 10 again in May. So obviously there was a length of time between asking those questions and they wouldn't have otherwise known about it to have programmed or premeditated that response. So it's quite a reassuring stability around that likelihood to revisit. The one that was least stable was the idea of whether the shopping centre visit was satisfying. So there's a high degree of variability at this point in time around whether someone finds the shopping centre experience satisfying visit to visit to visit. But far more stability around their likelihood to return. And overall, this, I think, stands us in good stead. Because going into this, many retail owners probably wouldn't have known how customers would adjust to this change in experience and whether they'd be sympathetic to those changes. And it would appear from this information that it's fair to say that customers are sympathetic towards those changes. They understand why those changes are taking place. And certainly it's not jeopardizing their satisfaction. They're reasonable in terms of judging satisfaction, and they're prepared to be committed around their likelihood to return in the future. Then on this next slide here, we can see how some positive factors around the overall impact of COVID-19 on shopping behaviours has actually improved between April and May. So it's not a staggering improvement, certainly not significant, but it's noticeable. You can see at either end of the scale here. So we had 5 points on a Likert scale, and we asked an overall question about impact on their behaviours at their centre of choice, wherever that may be. You can see in April that only 13% rated that their experience was not at all affected or only slightly impacted. By May, that had gone up by 6%. So almost 1 in 5 people are saying that their shopping experience currently is not at all affected or only slightly affected by COVID-19. So that's reassuring to know that it's headed in that direction. And at the other end of the scale, in terms of the significantly high impact measure, you can see that inversely, 22% perceived a significantly high impact of COVID-19 on their retail behaviours in April, and that dropped to 13% by May. So we're seeing a far more levelling, I guess, less polarised kind of perception around shopping and retail behaviours. And what we're seeing is far more of that bell curve. So over time, responses are returning to that kind of mean, to the bell curve, a natural kind of formation around the middle. So that's very reassuring. And then finally, around sense of safety and their intention to return, it's kind of interesting and reassuring to see that as that confidence returns, people are more supportive of the idea of keeping all locations open with precautionary measures. So already that was the most supported in April, and it's gone on to become 47% of respondents, I guess, a preference in terms of what they would like to see within retail behaviours. So almost the majority of shoppers now want all places open, but with precautions. This did change between the cities, I should flag, and certainly Melbourne represented a slightly different shift in this thinking, far more conservative shift, which might support the idea of why the government's done what it's done in terms of being slow to move on in breaking down those lockdown laws and reintroducing opening of retail centres. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of closing all locations temporarily. Dropped significantly from approximately 17% down to 5% within a month. So I think people have realised that closing all locations for a temporary period of time is just going to pose serious problems in terms of accessing essential services and goods. And so that's only actually supported by 1 in 20 people at this point in time. And it will be interesting to see how those two measures change over time. The other measures were fairly standard in terms of their support month to month. And then finally, wanted to talk about spending priorities and how they continue to evolve. So their spending behaviours have obviously been massively impacted. What we're yet to find out is the full effect of how those spending behaviours may be impacted permanently or long term. So as stores reopen, are people going to have a rush on and feel that they need to spend more in store because they haven't been able to for a while? Or are they going to be very conscious of what they're spending and continue a frugal sort of mindset well into the future? So one of the graphs we want to talk about was those things that are affecting, I guess, discouraging people from visiting shopping centres. So the crowds and the numbers of people is something that will be a real challenge over the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think, for shopping centre owners. It's increasing in terms of its level of detraction. When we asked people in April how it factored into their decision making, only 32% of people said that it was their sort of number one detraction in visiting a shopping centre. And by May, that had jumped to 37%. So we're seeing a rise there, a noticeable rise in terms of people's concern. And I think as they're seeing more signs of people returning to shopping centres and possibly less control and social distancing, there will be a certain proportion of the population that will be more concerned about that overall. And so how do we respond to that, I guess, is the question, particularly in the next 2 months as the lockdown starts to change. And then the second one is, it's good to know that the perception around lack of available stock has also improved, so that people think that's less of a concern than it used to be in terms of detracting them to want to visit a shopping centre or a retail establishment. So again, that'll be something to see in the future and whether that continues. In terms of categories, so this is the only slide we've got in terms of breaking down the individual categories, but you can see here that we've given you a percentage of people that didn't change the order in which they chose the spending amount for each of the categories. So we asked them to rank the categories from 1 through 10 in terms of how they currently spend at this point in time. So in April, it was at April, and in May, we were asking them about May. You can see that 73.7% of people selected supermarkets as number 1 in April and number 1 again in May, and didn't change their rating of that. Unsurprisingly, that's a very stable category, and it's in a class of its own at this point in time. And then you're looking at all the others are largely in a far less stable category in terms of the consistency of spend. So those that are more consistent are around technology and communications, albeit smaller amounts of spend. Those that are less consistent and more variable, we're looking at things like fashion and accessories. And it probably makes sense that that would be the case. Technology and comms starts to cross into the working from home area, so it's understandable that may have been less affected by an economic downturn overall. Sport and fitness was also up in terms of slightly improved spending as a category, and homewares as well sort of showed through. Again, this is based on perception, so if you have access to actual spend data from Quantium and so on, chances are there might be a bit of misalignment there between what people think they're spending money on and what they're actually spending money on. But at this point in time, they think they're spending more money in sport and fitness and on homewares, which again is very unsurprising. And then the final thing here is just the breakdown between cities. So you can see that the increases month to month are extremely slight. So this is a scale of plus or minus 10. We've zoomed in on the middle of that graph to show you, I guess, how there are fluctuations, minor fluctuations month to month between various categories across different cities. And I'll just pull out a few things which are sort of interesting and start to tell a story about what people probably value in different cities. As they're coming out of a situation like this and they're homebound, what do they want to spend money on in that situation? In Brisbane, it would appear that there's been an increase of spend on food, so takeaway food in particular. So comfort eating perhaps is what applies in Brisbane. It might also be a factor of more outdoor dining, more access to takeaway windows and hatches that can serve people. So that's sort of interesting in terms of the spend in Brisbane. In terms of the spend in Melbourne, there's 2 categories which have performed quite well between April and May in terms of increased spending, and that's that's fashion and accessories and sport and fitness. And a little bit of personal services is up slightly as well in Melbourne. So that kind of tells a story about, I guess, pampering oneself and making sure that it's all about looking good and feeling good. And then finally, Perth and Sydney tended to have a bit more spend on entertainment and leisure. So whether that's around recreation, it could also be around technology as well, a little bit around gaming. So I guess homebound recreation, leisure and entertainment. So downloading movies and streaming services and the like. So that's an interesting snapshot as to the different cities and how they're breaking down their increased spend. So we're right on 4:30, which is good. We've got a few different questions here. So the first question is, the recovery metric was 5% this month. So that was the first thing that we showed overall, increasing from 53 out of 100 to about 58 out of 100. Do you expect the next recovery metric in, say, 1 to 3 months to be the same, more or less? I mean, you would hope that the recovery metric would show an incremental improvement over time. As many of you will appreciate, 2 data points being April and May doesn't necessarily give us confidence to establish a trend in terms of a recovery. But I would say that in June, we would have the confidence, if that continued in the same way, to be able to put a line of best fit around those 3 data points and start to predict how that recovery may occur. It's probably fair to say that the recovery rate and metric before all of this was around 80. So we're still well short. We're still about 22 points short of where it probably needs to be for us to say that things are back to normal, so to speak. But yes, you would hope that it would continue to improve, and it will give us an idea more over time as to the rate of recovery rather than necessarily whether it will recover. Second question is the idea of what key customer trends do you think will stay beyond COVID-19 when lockdowns are lifted and when things return to normal? So I think we talked about that in terms of section 3 of the presentation. Online is really interesting, and the fact that there are people that have been forced to use online services that traditionally have withheld their desire to want to do so. So it'll be interesting to see whether that continues beyond COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the restrictions. That would be one thing I'd be looking at. Obviously, sanitation, a lack of willingness to want to travel to places far and wide, whether that's tourism-related holidays or whether that's just interstate travel. So if you're a centre that's based your turnover predominantly on domestic tourists and international tourists, that would be a question mark as to how long that would be impacted. So a Pacific Fair in Gold Coast or Westfield Sydney and the like. Also, the other trend that might be interesting is the idea of contactless. So using technology for the things that you want to have control over for ease of use, but at the same time, being able to go to a physical place and have the best of both worlds, have them select a certain range of products across multiple retailers and bring them to your car is the ultimate form of convenience. You get immediate gratification, you get someone to deliver it to your car, you don't have to pay for parking, and you don't have to go around to multiple stores. So something like that is an interesting one as to whether something like that as a service will continue beyond this point in time. And I'm aware that Mirvac and West and S Centre and a few others have set up those sorts of car delivery contactless services. So that's another one to watch in the future. And then finally, what do you consider be the key potential changes to tenant mix and shopping centres post-COVID-19 or 1 year later? So I think starting with the last few words there, yes, it's probably going to be quite a few years before we'll see a full shift in tenant mix. We talked about the idea of more localised. That could be interesting. What I'm hoping will be the case for the industry is that we can use this as a reset around how we negotiate those sort of rental deals. So understanding that there's a more even power balance between owners and tenants, and that we can reset those arrangements once we've realised that we've hit rock bottom, so to speak, that we can reset and renegotiate arrangements so that new opportunities can arise. Through these sorts of times of dramatic change, it allows us to really reinvent ourselves quite significantly. So I would hope that in the future, in terms of tenant mix, we're probably talking about obviously more services, more personal services, health and wellbeing, medical, other things like that, remaining still quite relevant. Food, experiences and so on, still remaining relevant. And then possibly there's a whole string of secondary related, more town centre services that would come to the fore. So childcare, commercial, gyms, and so on, offices even, civic services, libraries, and so on. So there's a whole range of different uses, which I think this will allow us to properly crack that model once and for all, and to have truly holistic retail centres. So there's the top three questions. So hopefully that's answered some of your thinking around where we're going in the future. Certainly after 2 months, you can start to see a little bit of a pattern and gives you an indication, but it doesn't establish a trend as yet. And it'll be interesting to see with more confidence in the next month or so where we're definitely going. We can more confidently say with 3 data points that this is the recovery rate and this is where we're headed probably in the future. In terms of the office report, as I mentioned before, this is very much looking at workers' experiences and perceptions of the workplace. We're all workers within some sort of workplace. Even if we predominantly work from home, we still no doubt work for a business that has a physical presence in an office somewhere. So it's quite interesting to see how this is shifting people's behaviours and perceptions as well. Retail's been significantly impacted, but so have workplaces in a different kind of way. And certainly there are things that workplaces will have to deal with in the near future that many retail centres won't have to worry about. And one of those might be imagining how we're going to get thousands of people in office towers up in lifts that are only meant to have 2 or 3 people in them at any one time, when people obviously try and travel within patterns of peak movements. So it's going to be a really difficult challenge for many office towers in particular, in terms of how they manage people, how they manage that recovery to ensure that they adhere to clear objectives around COVID-19, making sure their workplaces are safe places and that their workers feel comfortable and safe in those environments. So going to the first point here, very similar to retail. So we're seeing a slight gradual improvement on the lows of April. So almost everyone is feeling the impact, but the dust is settling, it's probably fair to say. And workplace is probably about 4 weeks behind retail. So retail was seeing some of these adjustments about 4 weeks before workplaces were. Workplaces had a very quick switch off in terms of people not working from physical offices, and they're only really now understanding what the impact might be for their businesses overall and how they can come up with solutions to meet this new age that they're working in. So only 6% thought they would be able to operate without significant impact indefinitely in April, but by May that had increased to 11%. So we asked people a question of how long they think they could operate without significant impact on their business. One of the further measures was indefinitely, in terms of any point in time that didn't have a specified date. And that almost doubled between April and May. So for business owners of office towers and workplaces, there's this big question around, will these people, these 1 in 10 business people, professionals that work out of professional workplaces, will they decide that they just don't actually need to come back into physical workplaces in the same way as they did previously? There's 1 in 10 of them that think that they could operate indefinitely under this current system. Will they be attracted to come back and to return to their normal business behaviours? So that's a bit of an unknown. And again, it's something that we're waiting on for probably June's research to see where that's tracking as a trend. And if that increased to say 15% or even 18 or 20% over time, when it's getting towards almost 1 in 5 people are saying they can operate this way indefinitely, you can imagine that it starts to pose some serious challenges around how we can get those people, such a high proportion of people, back into an office when they think that they're self-sufficient at home working under this situation. So you can see here another measure that we've asked people between the 2 months is the level of impact on their businesses of COVID-19. The good news is that you can see that we're coming off those kind of more extreme perceptions in April, and things are returning more to that bell curve or to the mean of what we'd expect over time as people are becoming a bit more realistic and they're understanding it's maybe not as extreme as they thought. So we're seeing slight reductions in people that think that it's got a significantly high impact on their business. So that's gone down from approximately 18% or so in April down to about 16% in May. So it's shaved a little bit off there. But inversely, it's also reduced in terms of the idea of no impact at all on their business. So that's gone from 6% of decision makers endorsing the idea that COVID-19 had no impact at all, and that has subsided to almost half, so 3.2% in May, having no impact at all. So you're seeing a far more regular bell curve overall, which is good, and it provides reassurance in terms of being able to say where the mean is overall in the market and being able to respond to that middle ground. When we look at this question based on cities, though, it starts to tell a really interesting story around those cities that might be more exposed and have more extreme impact than others. So we asked this survey across 4 cities in Australia, and we've got Sydney and Melbourne that have a similar profile in terms of responses, and Brisbane and Perth that have a similar profile. So you'll notice that Sydney and Melbourne have all of 100% of those businesses that say, decision makers that say that there's a significantly high impact on their business from COVID-19 have come from Sydney and Melbourne. And in Melbourne, it's actually 22% of respondents are in that highest, most extreme category of a significantly high impact. Whereas you can see in Brisbane and Perth, there's absolutely no responses in that category overall. And there's about 150 responses for Brisbane and Perth and 150 each for Melbourne and Sydney. So to not get any responses at all, you can confidently say that it really is seen as not that much of an issue, an extreme issue in those cities, as it is seen as an extreme issue to the same level of quantity in Sydney and Melbourne. And then finally, we've got this idea around how long businesses can operate. So at the beginning slide of this section, this first point, I talked about the idea of businesses operating indefinitely and going from 6% to 11% within the month of April to May. And you can also see that what is a dramatic reduction is the idea of businesses coming to terms with the short-term challenges around working this way. So when we asked the question in April, how long you could operate without significant impact under this new way of doing business, 20%, 1 in 5 respondents said, I could only last up to 4 weeks working this way. Obviously, 4 weeks has already elapsed, and all of those businesses have had to find solutions. And when we've asked the same question now in May, that has gone from 20% down to about 2.5% of businesses. So that tells us that basically businesses have learnt to adapt to this new norm. They've put things in place, and certainly they're aware that they'll have to last longer than 4 weeks. And as a result of that, it would seem that the middle ground in terms of where people think that they're able to operate like this without significant impact would be somewhere between sort of 3 and 6 months, probably closer to the 6-month mark. And that's probably about the length of time that this will continue to in some way, shape or form before there's completely normal workplace behaviours, i.e. before we could consider not having social distancing at play. So it would appear that decision makers and workers, professional workers, are realistic about how long this is going to take to change. The second point is a really positive one. It's around the idea of the perceptions of the government stimulus. So whichever country you're tuning in from, no doubt your government has provided some degree of stimulus. If you're in the US, the UK and Australia, it's a very high proportion of GDP. So we're probably in a very fortunate position that business has taken that as a sign of confidence. And what we're seeing with this is that there's been quite a significant shift between April and May in terms of the perceptions around the value of that government stimulus. So you can see that in April, where the government stimulus was newly announced and there was less of a understanding of its impact and the context of it and the amounts that were at play, there was a really disparate view around what sort of value it was going to provide. So some people thought, almost 30% of respondents thought that it would have a significantly high impact. And at the same time, we had 1 in 4 people, 25%, saying it would have no impact at all. As you're seeing here, by the time we've gotten to May, there's far more of a bell curve, which is what you'd expect in terms of where that impact is going to be felt. And so there's far more representation in terms of some impact and high impact and even slight impact. So people have shifted slightly towards thinking that it would have more of an impact for their business over time between April and May. It hasn't been significant, but it has been noticeable. And it will be interesting to see whether this perception changes as people have started receiving their first payments in the last week or two into their businesses, to see how that might build confidence overall. We did a confidence metric for office as well as the one we did for retail. There was no change between the 2 months, interestingly. And I think part of that relates to the idea that the business confidence is very much reliant on seeing the government stimulus come into their bank accounts. And so it'll be interesting to see in June whether that actually shifts and whether we're seeing a lot more confidence as it's gone into people's bank accounts overall. Another way of looking at the government stimulus is talking about the flow and impact. So asking about the need for rent reductions. So decision makers, those that were in the position to make a decision, were asked whether they planned on asking for a rent reduction overall. And you can see here that the numbers of people that were planning on asking for a rent reduction has gone from 31% in April to 20% in May, which is reassuring for any commercial landlords. 20%, 1 in 5, is probably a proportion you can deal with. 30% is getting towards a dangerously high proportion. So certainly that's reassuring news. On the flip side, though, there appear to be more people that are on the fence. So as the government stimulus has been announced, but it hasn't been realised, and there's more unknowns as to how long this might go on for, you can see that there's been more than a doubling of people that aren't sure. So it's taken from not only the yes people who were planning on asking for a rent reduction, but also from the no people as well. So it'll be really interesting to see how that pans out. The good news is that there's not as much distress in the short to medium term for commercial landlords. And it would appear that a lot more businesses are actually on the fence. And if we can work with them in a tailored way, we'll be able to adjust accordingly over time. The third category is around this idea of perceptions discouraging people from wanting to go into the workplace. And they are evolving in the same way as retail behaviours are evolving. Understandably, things are changing on almost a daily basis. It's fair to say that some people have flirted with the idea of going back into the workplace, and many are now seriously considering how regularly they can or should go into the workplace. So between April and May, it's become a real possibility. And for some people, it's become an actual experience. So that's changed people's perceptions as to what sorts of things they should be concerned about. And when we've asked them to rate the various detractions, you can see overall that there are 4 factors here. So this doesn't give you a sense of how those individual factors are lessening over time, but what it does give you a sense is how the ranking of these 4 factors is changing over time. So relative to each other factor, how are they perceived in terms of a level of negative influence? So you can see that overall, unsurprisingly, the idea of contracting COVID-19 is the #1 detraction from going into a workplace still, although it's slightly down from last month, which is the opposite of retail, which went slightly up. Unknowingly passing it on to others has gone noticeably down by about 5% or so, which is good, and that's in line with the retail experience. And also the idea of the risk of not slowing the spread of COVID-19 generally. So not doing your bit within the overall grand scheme of society has also diminished as the risk has diminished and the number of cases has diminished. The one thing that's gone up, though, you'll notice there, is the idea of contracting or passing on COVID-19 whilst travelling to and from work between April and May. So that's gone up approximately 10% or so between those 2 months. And so that poses questions around, you can do everything you can within workplaces, you can monitor and regulate the flow of people, you can introduce services around meal delivery so that people don't need to leave their workplace floor during the day. But at the end of the day, you need to also work with your tenants and customers to work out how are people going to get to the office to make sure that that complete end-to-end experience is safe and is seen as desirable or at least tolerable by workers within professional environments. And then the next slide talks about, I guess, the positive benefits. So this might start to talk about some of the answers as to why people like face-to-face working and how we can work with them to get them back into the office. So if some of the detractions are around the risk of catching COVID-19 or how I can deal with public transport and getting to and from the office, some of the benefits that they also see that are increasing over time is the idea for easier collaboration. So people like the idea of timeliness of response when they work from home, and certainly people are seeing that that's increasing in terms of their perception between April and May, and that's sort of the #1 benefit of face-to-face between April and May. So they can get answers. They know people are actually going to be there at their desks. That there's no risk that they're going to be occupied doing something like putting a load of washing on or attending to homeschooling. The other thing that's increased noticeably, though, between the 2 months is the easier ability to collaborate face-to-face. So I think that that's the key to being able to pitch the right message. If you want to be able to collaborate, if you want to be productive and efficient and deal with things in real time and make decisions that need to be made to keep businesses productive, then you need to do those from a physical workplace, and we can provide the environment for them which is safe and desirable for them to use. Interestingly, as a side note, superior culture and morale hasn't actually improved in terms of people's perceptions. So between April and May, people still think it's relatively an unimportant benefit, not that beneficial to working face-to-face, which is interesting. And the other one that's also noteworthy there is the idea of higher levels of teamwork. So I don't know if that's because they feel that there's a good level of teamwork working from home, and it's therefore replaced their perception that the workplace can provide that, or whether they've realized that actually offices aren't the most desirable places to work from, and that they don't like their team members, and they've realized that through having distance from them, they actually enjoy the experience. I'm not sure what's at play there, but it's almost halved between April and May as they've become more accustomed to working from home. Second last area is about this idea of valuing the workplace long term. So one of the key things, not so much with retail, because you know that customers are going to have to buy from physical stores, they're going to have to return to some degree. But with workplace decision makers and workers, there's not necessarily that need. You increasingly can do work from a more mobile setting, from home, from third spaces and so on. And so there is this need to understand whether it's changed their perception of the value of physical workplaces long term, and whether we might need to change that and work with them as COVID-19 recovers and we all come back to physical workplaces. So you can see that in April, 65% of decision makers believe that the emergence of COVID-19 made them less likely to release in the future, whenever that lease may come up. By May, this had dropped 11% to 54% of decision makers. So it's good to see that they're actually realizing there is a role for physical workplaces in the future, despite the rise of COVID-19. It was also stable in terms of workplace satisfaction. 87% of respondents were satisfied with their workplace choice, which demonstrates that they probably would be likely to come back. They do like their workplaces. They wouldn't mind a rent reduction, but ultimately, they do like them as places to work from, and they're satisfied. 87% of respondents satisfied by their current workplaces. And then the final question that we had around long-term value, we had a measure around a statement of, does it make you question the long-term value of workplaces? In April, that was 62% of respondents supported the idea that COVID-19 had made them question the long-term value of their workplace. By May, that had dropped to 47%. So it had gone down 15% in terms of that I guess, questioning of their workplaces in light of COVID-19. So again, that might be because they've realized the benefit of physical workplaces, or it might be because they see that COVID-19 has a lessened impact on their businesses and on how they do business. So therefore, they're more likely to value their workplaces. And then finally is this idea of the macro trends associated with the economy and giving confidence to decision makers, in particular to make, I guess, those longer term investments that will allow them to commit to spaces in those 5, 7, 10-year leases. So whilst restrictions on the movement of people still is seen as a big negative associated with COVID-19, there are other factors, in particular the lack of resources or goods, that are really posing some challenges in people's minds. So if we look at this graph here, we can see between April and May, there's been an increased reality check around what factors might pose problems for businesses. So this was a select all that apply question. So hence it doesn't equals more than 100%. You can see here that more than 40% of people said the restrictions on the movement of people, and that's up from about 35% in April. So that's going to be seen as a factor. And I think they might be understanding that the number of people in lifts, the number of people on work floors and so on will start to impact on their business operation. The loss of income, again, is becoming more of a factor, and general customers postponing decisions is becoming a factor that's out of their control. Things like the closure of non-essential services is actually diminished as they've realised that, that there's actually plenty of services that are still open and they can still operate. But the one thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of if they're a business that produces physical goods, they're starting to understand that the supply chain associated with producing their end product is becoming more difficult. And so if you've got tenants that are producing physical goods, this is certainly going to be something that's on their mind. And considering that many of the respondents weren't associated with businesses that produce physical goods, it's fair to say that if we only ask this question of those businesses, this would undoubtedly be the #1 factor by quite a margin. So just something to think about as we move forward, and how those businesses might be more affected than service-based businesses or knowledge-based businesses that don't need to rely on physical goods and the transport of physical goods. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about here was just general business uncertainty that's on the rise. So the idea of high unemployment has come down as a factor in people's minds, as business decision makers' minds. But the idea of general uncertainty has increased between the 2 months. And it probably makes sense because unemployment is actually a benefit to many business operators, because they can get access to personnel that they might not have previously at probably cheaper rates. So it's fair to say they're realizing that there are actually some benefits associated with high unemployment, and that actually it's more around uncertainty generally, which is posing a problem. So that's a summary of the office report. So hopefully in that 20 minutes or so, we've saved you the opportunity to actually have to read the report and given you a highlights reel there. So in terms of the questions, we've got a couple of questions here in terms of office. So what do you see as the future of co-working spaces? Will this still be an attractive proposition in the market? Will this be viable for operators? Will the headcount per floor ratio change significantly? So there are a number of questions that are probably all related. So co-working spaces are obviously a high headcount per square metre. So they're a particular type of office work environment that is probably going to feel the stress of COVID-19 more than others, simply because it's managing the flow of people probably more so than an office that has a lower ratio of people per square metre. And also there's the idea of movement of people within co-working spaces. So the idea of sanitising spaces after they've been used for an hour or half an hour. Hot desking is obviously a high proportion within those sorts of co-working or shared spaces. So it is probably fair to say that co-working is more exposed in the future. It will still be an attractive proposition. So there's things that co-working operators and third space operators can do. Obviously, notifying people around what your practices are, limiting the number of people within spaces, sanitising space on a regular basis, and there's a big visibility point to that, particularly with high touch surfaces and so on. Cancelling those sorts of spaces and events that may well be where people come together, limiting the flow of people, and limiting those congregation points, lunchrooms and so on. So they're probably the key things that are probably worth addressing, but I don't think that they would stop a co-working space from being able to operate. And certainly if you're operating third spaces, you would continue to do that in the future, but you just do it more slowly and with more caution, and you'd obviously survey workers to make sure that they've got a desire to use those spaces. And then finally, what is the one thing workplaces need to change to make coming into an office more compelling than being at home? It's funny, one thing that came out of the research was the idea of comfort. So people think that they're more productive in May than April, and they also think they're more comfortable in May than April. So whatever you can do to try and mimic that domestic setting at home in the workplace settings that people return to would be a good thing. So that comes back to lighting, furnishings, privacy around spaces, more intimate spaces, and so on, to try and mimic what they might have been exposed to, because they are increasingly over time thinking that their homes are more comfortable and more efficient and productive workplaces. So there's an answer to those two questions. We've just clocked over to 5 o'clock. So it's time for us to sign off. We hope that you've learned something from the presentations. By all means, feel free to share the report with your colleagues. And if you'd like to discuss custom research with Skyfire or with ourselves, we'd be open to that discussion. Certainly custom research is going to be more specific to your needs and give you more direct answers as to how your customers and tenants are feeling. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the week.
Cool. Yeah.
We're out. Should we end it for all?